I'd like to welcome the witnesses for the committee's evidence session, which is both on the Science Minister's responsibilities in general and the final session of the committee's engineering biology inquiry. So we're delighted to have with us Lord Vallance, Minister for Science, Research and Innovation in the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, Alexandra Jones, Director General for Science, Innovation and Growth, and Dr. Isabel Webb, Deputy Director for Technology, Strategy and Security. The session is being broadcast on Parliament Live TV, and a full transcript is being taken, which will be made available to you shortly after the meeting to make any minor corrections. And if you think of any evidence you didn't get a chance to talk about or any data that might be useful to us, we would be delighted to receive that as formal evidence after the session. So can we welcome you very warmly and say thank you very much for finding time to come and give evidence to us so early in this new Parliament. We're delighted to have you here and delighted that you have made so much time for us. I know, Lord Vallance, you would like to make an opening statement on the general science policy area, and I wonder if you could weave into that the opening question that I would like to ask you, which is, now that you're inside government rather than advising government, we'd really be interested to hear your views on your role, on what you think the role of the Science Minister is. And of course, we'd be interested to hear about your key priorities and what you want to achieve having taken on this role. So we'd also, of course, be interested after this roughly 100 days, what you feel you have achieved already, or what you've at least feel you've kicked off. And very interested to know how your experience as being a Chief Scientific Advisor, how that is influencing your approach to being inside government. But please, we're interested to hear what you have to say.
Great, thank you very much. Welcome this opportunity to meet with the committee. And I'll try and answer all of those questions in my first few statements. The first thing I would say is that, as I see it, it's difficult or impossible to think of a single area of government policy or operations where science, technology or innovation wouldn't make a difference. And for a modern government, that means this has to be a very effective function for government. If you take healthcare, it's obvious, but it's equally true for housing, for planning, for defence and security, for education. And so it's a ubiquitous need. It's also, of course, incredibly important for the economy, and 7 out of the 10 biggest companies in the world are science and technology companies. They grow faster than other companies, albeit, of course, with some volatility. And we know that countries that get this right do better economically than those that don't. So this is absolutely essential. And in thinking about this role, I would draw a distinction between the ministerial role and the government Chief Scientific Advisor role quite clearly. I mean, one is advisory, obviously, but there's also another distinction, which is the government Chief Scientific Advisor's role is to provide science for policy, and this role is clearly about policy for science, and I think that distinction is rather important. In thinking about what the priorities for me in this role, I want to just outline 5 things. The first is that as a country which has been highly dependent on knowledge-based economy and is very good at science and technology, we must protect and grow, as the economy allows it to grow, the basic curiosity-driven science that we do in this country. And I make that statement because that is the work that ultimately is the goose that lays the golden egg that in years to come creates all the economic benefit and societal benefits. And yet it is something that I think is not an area that ministers and others should try and determine what goes on in. It's something that academics and investigators and researchers should determine what they do in that area, and we should protect and grow that pot as the economy allows it to grow, and protect that very, very carefully by by any measure, we do extremely well at it. And indeed, at the investment summit yesterday, it was a repeated comment that was made to me by many people was, we love the fact you're good at that in the UK. So we need to get that right. The second area is, of course, we need to be as good and as prepared and as able as we can be to develop from ideas that come from us or from elsewhere. So the D in R&D we need to be good at. That's a skills question, it's an infrastructure question. And in this area, I think there is a very legitimate role for government to say what the priorities are and what should happen. And of course the industrial strategy and the missions become very crucial, and I think we need to be very clear how we're going to structure that part of the system to be able to support all of that. The third is to come back to the economic growth story. We know that we've done well, or better anyway, in terms of startups in this country, much better than a decade ago. But we also know we're not where we need to be. And although we do better than the rest of Europe, and we probably only third to now US and China in this, we've got room for improvement there. But that's not bad. But where we're not doing well is scale up of those companies. And there are all sorts of reasons for that I'm sure we'll come into. So that's my third area. And then I want to describe two lenses through which all of this, I think, needs to be considered. The first is that all of this has to be in the benefit of the citizen and society. So it's about ensuring, as we undertake our policies and the operation of this, that we keep the citizen and societal need absolutely central. And the final point is that, of course, this is crucial for resilience and security, and it needs to be looked at both in that lens and the international perspective. So those are my 5 areas that I want to work on. You asked what has been achieved in the 3 months or so since the government has been in place, and I'll give some specific ones that are in my patch and then a bit more broadly on DSIT. There are some funding announcements which I think have been important. UK Biobank has been given more money and able to do an important interaction with the private sector, with Amazon. Quantum hubs have been funded to the tune of 100 million. MRC protein phosphorylation unit in Dundee got 30 million, which again I think is incredibly important. That's a very, very critical activity that's benefited industry and academia. And of course there's been about 140 million on various medical research things, including 5 hubs for medical technology. But then more specifically in terms of departmental activity, the Regulatory Innovation Office has been announced, and we're now in the process of recruiting a chair for that. The National Data Library work has started on that, but it's early days. There's a sort of scoping going on around that. In terms of artificial intelligence, to try and redress to some extent the balance, because I think there's been an almost exclusive focus on safety, and safety is important, but there's a huge amount of opportunity, and the AI opportunities work that Matt Clifford has been asked to look at will report out shortly. And then 2 other things. I think we've done quite a lot over these 3 months to try and rekindle appropriate relationships with Europe in science and technology, and indeed with the G7 ministers as well. And I attended the G7 science ministers meeting in my first week in post. And as you will have seen, I also decided to re-advertise the UKRI CEO and the Innovate UK CEO roles. And the reason for that was not because we didn't get good people in the first round, we did, but I felt the job description didn't adequately reflect the ambition for those 2 organisations, and it needed also to take into account things like the government's approach to missions and industrial strategy, and that we needed to make sure that was well reflected in the job description. And I'm pleased to say that those processes are progressing well, and we've got new applicants as well as the old ones in the system.
Thank you very much, and some of those are very much topics that we'll be coming back to. Can I just follow up though, given that we have a government that is so focused on missions and industrial strategy and delivery, how is it going trying to persuade your colleagues that we have to protect and grow curiosity-driven research. How are you doing that?
That for me is very clearly something for the spending review next year, because it's a long-term question. And nobody's pushed back and said, well, that's not correct. And many people have said, yes, that's of course what we need to do. And it is sort of what we've done, but we've done it, in my view, implicitly rather than explicitly. I would like us to be explicit that this is an important part of what the UK has to have, and that we shouldn't neglect it. And Paul Nurse, in his review, highlighted the fact that, yes, we're really good at that, but others are getting good at it too, and we shouldn't rest on our laurels. So it's really about making sure that that is visible, clear, and as I say, my view is that that is not an area where ministers should be in dabbling. It's an area where, as long as we're sure that we've got the construct right to support that, it's where the ingenuity, the creativity, the inventiveness of those doing the research should lead what happens, because it's all very easy to look now and sort of look at an area and say, well, isn't that an important area? Of course, it started 25, 30 years ago when it was far from obvious that it was an important area, and that's not somewhere where ministers need to be, in my view.
I think we would all support that. That's an area that ministers should keep out of. But of course, there's always the big question of how much of UKRI's budget should be devoted to curiosity-driven research, and how much of it should be at the more applied end. And I think that's probably a rather more difficult thing to think about.
It's difficult and essential, which is why it's on my list of things to do for SR next year, because I think we do need to start being more explicit about that.
So we will look forward to hearing more about that, but you're not going to tell us now.
I don't know the answer now.
Great. Let me move on to Lord Lucas, please.
The Science and Technology Framework requires action across the whole of government on issues like skills, procurement, regulation and support for critical technologies. How do you persuade other departments to view supporting this as part of their responsibilities? What forums do you have to meet with them?
A very important question. And of course, when the framework was set up, it was precisely to try and get that all-of-government approach, because the growth of science and technology, and particularly also the company formation, isn't solved by individual point interventions. It's solved by a systems-wide approach. And I'm pleased that there's been progress on many of those areas. So the Procurement Act, due to come in next year, I think will help. I've met with Minister Gould, who's the Minister in the Cabinet Office for Procurement, to try and make sure that that is fully tied into what we're trying to do. And I do think the missions actually present quite an interesting opportunity to link the procurement to the missions. And Skills England, of course, is linked to us in terms of looking at what the skills will be for the high-tech and other industries of the future. So there are a number of bilateral ways in which that happens. Regulatory Innovation Office, I'm going to get together with the ministers from other departments. I've already written to them to say I want to meet on a regular basis to think about the areas that they cover, because many of the regulators sit in their departments. And then ultimately, of course, it's important that the Prime Minister has decided to have a Cabinet committee on science and technology, and that is where the really important cross-government bits of this can come, so that there's alignment and clear understanding of which departments are covering which bits.
Thank you. What is your vision for the future of science in the civil service? What needs to be done, for instance, to make sure that we field really good people in standard setting and in meetings where I've heard criticisms of low-powered teams being sent to really technical conferences? What needs to be done to improve the status of scientists and particularly science graduates within the civil service?
Yes, this is something...
What ways do we need to draw in people from outside? And I'd be really interested to hear the thoughts of your two career civil servants.
I will ask them to come in at the end of this, or maybe you want them to start?
Yes.
Want them to start? You want me to start? Okay. I'm in danger of straying into my old job here, because this was something I was very, very obsessed with as Government Chief Scientific Advisor. It is absolutely essential, for all the reasons I've said, that the civil service does have an appropriate number of experts, both engineering and science. I'll give you a specific example. In DESNES and the need for the energy transition, I'm really pleased that they've moved to a sort of mission control centre, which needs to be, in my view, packed full of engineers, and they know that's my view, and I think they will bring in engineers to do that. I'm very pleased that the fast stream has now got the target for 50% with a STEM degree. When I started as Government Chief Scientific Advisor, it was 10% of the intake. So there's very clear ambition to get that right. There is a need also to provide tools for people. So as well as having the right skills in the civil service, I think a greater use of data visualization tools is incredibly important, because that's what brings this alive for non-scientists very often and non-engineers. And so getting that side of things is important, and there are some quite significant advances that have taken place there. I will, though, maybe make one comment which I've made previously to the Cabinet Secretary and the HR team in the civil service. We are never going to compete with the private sector on salaries, so let's not pretend we can. We can do better in places than we're currently doing, but we're not going to compete. We can, however, compete on purpose, and there is a very strong desire to do things that make a difference to society, and the ability of the AI Safety Institute to recruit really top people at not industry salaries is because they want to do something useful. So we can compete on that, very much so. But the one thing that's really, really important, and this may sound trivial, but it's not, is the speed of recruitment. If you don't snap people up quickly and get a very effective system for appointments, you will lose them because something else will come. It's very fast in this area. So the speed of recruitment process is actually, in my view, quite an important part of this. Maybe I'll stop there, and Alex, I don't know if you want to comment.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is something that, as DSIT, we're taking incredibly seriously, but I know that the Government Chief Scientific Advisor is as well. As DSIT, the second version of DSIT, we're actually a digital centre now, so we're the Digital Centre of Government, and we've got a whole range of very expert skills that we have brought into the department as part of that, and they are experts in their particular area, and I think that is that's been really helpful in just bringing in different expertise and different ways of thinking. I think we've got a mix of ways in which we need to do this. Some of this is the long term, the fast stream and the graduate programme, and just bringing in people early on, bringing their expertise and making sure that's used. We've got an expert exchange programme in DSIT as well, so that's about bringing in people for shorter periods of time, recognising that actually this may not be their career, but they might want to contribute for a specific programme or bring their expertise, or we might want them, and we do actively go out, and actually there's an ongoing secondment programme with some of our partner organisations like Met Office and MPL. I think the other issue is about how do we incentivise that science and engineering and technical expertise to be used, so we don't bring in the experts and then not actually use the expertise. We try and force them into the way the machine always works. I think there's some really great examples of that in DSIT, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague in a moment, where I'm sure she'll talk to you about how many PhDs are in her team. But I think one of the things we're trying to do, you've got the long-term changes, you've got the kind of short-term bringing in experts, and I think we're bringing in more and more people on the digital side. I do think there's something about how do we make sure that science is part of the way of thinking. We're doing evidence-based approaches to policy. We are asking that for that technical expertise at the right points. And we've got a bit more to do, I think, on that. The final thing I'd say is, interestingly, neither of us are career civil servants. Both of us have had time out of the civil service doing different things. And I think it's hugely valuable to be a career civil servant because you do move around so much, you learn a great deal. I think what we're also seeing is a mix of people moving in and out, and that brings some of those skills and the ability to use them differently, which will matter too. So we're not there, but I think we are making some progress.
And Izzy is a great scientist.
She is.
Yes, I mean, I won't say too much more because I think my colleagues have covered it, but I am a biologist by training. I did a PhD before deciding that I felt that government could do with a few more people who understood science in it, and decided to make the change myself to move into the civil service. And I was one of those 10% of fast streamers a few years ago. And I definitely felt one of the minority when I joined, and it's something I've been very passionate about since joining. I think DSIT is a really exciting place to be because we are now starting to attract those sciences, and when jobs are advertised, scientists are applying for them. So very proud that the engineering biology team has a third bioscience PhDs in the team, which is really exciting. And across our tech and strategy team and our wider teams working on technologies, we're seeing more and more people coming in from those science and technical backgrounds, both from academia and industry. And what's really great is the support network we get, both inside the department as well as the Government Office for Sciences, science and engineering profession. That gives us a chance to meet other scientists, keep cultivating those networks, and retain a link back to the academic and industrial worlds that we came from, so that we can keep bringing in the expertise and stay on top of the most recent advancements.
Very encouraging to hear.
I suppose the challenge is that it's great to hear that DSIT is full of scientists, but it would be nice to hear that other government departments, but that 50% of the fast stream, if they're all in DSIT, then we're kind of...
if they were all in DSIT would have to expand enormously. But no, I agree with you, they need to be everywhere.
Lord Vallance.
Very quickly, I mean, very good news from you on that question, but do you have a similar group of experts sitting in the Treasury who understand what you're doing and support it?
I couldn't tell you how many biologists are in the Treasury, but I could certainly tell you that the real value of people coming in from outside into the civil service is we learn how to communicate our science in a really great way to help them to understand. I think if you couldn't explain what science was, you probably wouldn't be able to get a phosphorylation centre funded up in Scotland. And so the real skill I think scientists bring to the civil service is being able to break down those technical issues into much more simple ways, because you need the diversity of thought that comes from the other backgrounds as well.
Yeah, they need it.
I would just add one other thing on this. When I joined as Government Chief Scientific Advisor, a number of people came up to me when I started this agenda of increasing science in the civil service and whispered, I'm a physicist actually, but I didn't dare tell anyone. I don't think it's like that now.
Let's move on to Baroness Northover, if we may.
Yes, and this is about the industrial strategy, and I think that generally we would very much welcome the fact that the government is committed to having one. And of course, yesterday this was published. And it is in many ways, as it were, a holding position. It's relatively general, and it's pending wide consultation and a strategy council being set up and actually being in operation. And so therefore, in the context of that, wanted to ask you a few questions. There are certain things that it mentions in here that would have been global challenges, like the pandemic, the energy price shock. Then there are the UK-specific things, for example, Brexit, and including the reduction of investment of 11% over 3 years relative to trend, which is UK-specific. So my question is, to what extent are the strengths that we're looking at here and that you're talking about built on events, as it were, and developments prior to those? I note what you say about not resting on laurels in terms of basic science, and I note in here, in terms of jobs in renewables, that Germany is twice as far ahead, or has twice as many jobs, Sweden 3 times as many jobs, Denmark 4 times as many jobs as in renewables as we do. And so in the context of the kind of analysis that you've got in there and the general thrust of this going forward, I wanted to know how far DSIT is going to feed into this, how your science and technology framework, which you developed before, might feed in. In other words, what now, having issued this?
Yes, thank you. We are absolutely joined at the hip with DBT on this, and the officials work very closely together. We will lead on 2 of the areas, which are digital and technologies and life sciences, and we have a science and technology input to every single area, including ensuring that the science and technology framework is used as the basis of thinking about each of these sectors. And the thing about the framework, which, as you will probably be aware, was widely welcomed by industry and investors, is it won't be exactly the same things that are needed for every area. Some will need more of one than another. And then the other point, which I think is going to be important here, is that in all of these areas, there's a risk with an industrial strategy that you simply support the current incumbents. And one of our roles is to make sure that the emerging areas are properly understood and taken account of, because they may be the very high growth areas of the future. And we will certainly do that as well. So I think the answer is we're well plugged in. You're right, it is evolving so that there will be a fuller explanation of the whole thing, but we're involved both vertically, if you like, and horizontally in this.
Can I ask a follow-up on this? What part do you see being played by the life sciences as part of an industrial strategy, or will the life sciences have its own sectoral strategy underneath a broader industrial strategy? How is your thinking?
It's one of the 8 areas in the industrial strategy. So there are 8 vertical areas that have been described, one of which is life sciences, which will have its own...
in that sense, sectoral...
Sorry?
It'll have its own strategy along with it.
There's a Life Sciences Council that will lead that. So I think the point of the industrial strategy is to lay out the whole picture. Of course, each one will need its own special plan to deliver against that, and each sector is different. And of course there's also overlap, which is why our need to have science technology running across is really important, because obviously AI, for example, goes across all of these things.
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. Just pressing further on yesterday's announcement, there are a series of priority areas laid out in it, but obviously that's going to be subject to further consultation. And there were the priorities that you identified in the technology framework, and then there's the missions. Do you think people out there are keeping up? And what plans have you got, or what can be done to have a degree of medium-term security about what the priority is going to be for the future, so that and also what comfort can you give to those folks who were in priority areas that are now no longer priority areas?
Well, the first thing to say is I completely back the notion of priorities for this. And I also, as I said right at the beginning, don't think this applies to the basic curiosity-driven science that we're talking about. Okay, that's different. That has to be separate. So I completely think prioritisation is right. I noticed the Institute for Government's been quick off the mark and published something on this already, saying, well, these are pretty much the obvious things you would go for. I think they pulled out defence as the one that there was new for them. In terms of the number of different things, I don't think there is a need for anyone to sort of out there to be worrying about the science and technology framework, because in a way that's just a way of thinking about things. It's not a sort of set of priorities. It's saying as you look at each sector, you must think about these things end to end and don't forget one of them. The missions, clearly this falls into the number one mission, which is growth. And the growth mission is the place where the industrial strategy sits overall, because this is what's going to drive investment and drive further growth. And the other missions, of course, are the priorities for the government. The Prime Minister's made clear his priorities to drive against, and I think provide a coherent way of thinking about things across government. This is about join up across government. So I think really only 2 bits to think of: the industrial strategy as the sector areas and the missions as the outcome that government is looking for.
How do you balance? I mean, you mentioned in here. It mentions migration, for example. If growth is number one, but there are conclusions that you reach in terms of Britain's position on migration, which might be politically unpalatable. How do you drive that forward?
Well, I don't think that's for me as Science Minister to drive forward, but I think it's obviously a real recognition that this country has depended on high-skilled migration for many, many, many years, and will continue to do so for the future. And we've got, I've visited quite a few companies since I've started this role, and I don't think there's a single one I've been to which has been populated at the sort of technical scientific level simply by people who are trained in this country. I mean, we're attractive for people from overseas, and we need to remain attractive.
Can I ask, at the moment, I think some of us are a bit intrigued by the industrial strategy because it seems to cover everything. It's hard to imagine anything that you might not include under this incredibly broad range of advanced manufacturing, clean energy, creative, defence, digital, financial services, life science, professional and business services. But a strategy needs prioritisation. So is that what we shall expect as the next step?
Well, I think well, first of all, I think this is, as I said, a list which is a sensible list of things that government needs to have as its priorities for the industrial strategy. And we are a country which is highly dependent on knowledge-based economy, and therefore it's not surprising we've got a lot of these areas that we are currently good at and could be good at. Within each one, there will need to then be a clear idea of what is going to be progressed within that and how that will be done, and that will be as the industrial strategy works up and the Industrial Strategy Council gets into place. There will be more flesh on the bones of each of these. It's interesting.
There will be a link through from what UKRI research, apart from the curiosity-driven research, but the big part of UKRI that's about the applied research. There will be that link right through to these.
Absolutely, that needs to link into this and into the missions, and there needs to be a clear link. This can't be a rebadging of things that you might loosely fit under one of these headings. There needs to be a very clear system to do that, as I'm sure you'll be. And by the way, I should just say, you're right, this is quite comprehensive in what it covers. I can absolutely guarantee there will be lots of people who think they've been left out.
Yeah.
And that's inevitable. But I think if we go back to the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, which was set up when there was last an industrial strategy, there are some things that we can learn from that. I think there were some things that succeeded in that programme, and there were some things which are definitely lessons for the future. So, for example, the requirement for a company to put money in at the same time as government meant that much of the applications were from big industrial primes rather than SMEs. So we need to get SMEs deeply involved in this. Second is we need to make sure that the work that goes on under the R&D in this is actually is timely in relation to what the objectives are. So there's no point funding something to deliver in 10 years' time if the answer is we need to do something in 5 years' time or 3 years' time. So we need to get that urgency into the system and make sure that it's really clear what is required to deliver against this. And the third, it goes back to an earlier question, which is there needs to be a customer. And I think in some cases, the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, the customer wasn't entirely aligned with what was going on. So the department or whoever it was wasn't ready to pick up or catch the ball when it came out to be caught. And so we need to tie this in very firmly to what is required and therefore create some procurement signals.
Thank you. Move on to Baroness Neville-Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Can I come to the dread question of money? The government has said that it wants to deliver certainty and flexibility to the R&D institutions and provide them with 10-year budget settlements, which is quite an innovation. Do you know when we're likely to see that in operation and how it will actually work, given that most other budgeting is going to be shorter framework? I mean, are you optimistic that you will actually be able to do this? Because one of the things that the industrial strategy framework says is, it seems to me rightly, that in 10 years' time, the economy will look quite different from its current shape. Well, if that's true, how do you balance a 10-year settlement with presumably objectives and priorities and people knowing what the money is going to be spent on, at the same time as actually being able to ride the change in technological priorities and indeed probably some things becoming much more important than they previously were and others taking a lower space.
Yes.
So it seems to me there's a lot of dynamics in this.
Thank you for joining me in my head on this, which is all these issues are exactly the ones that I've been thinking about pretty hard since taking up this post. And I'll bring Alex in a minute, but I don't think 10-year funding is some sort of easy blanket solution. It is, I think, something that needs to be targeted based on some clear principles. What are the principles that would make 10-year funding more appropriate than some other form of funding? And how do you avoid the problem you've described, which is 10-year funding sounds great until year 7, when inflation and changes have caught up with you, and then it's a disaster. So by definition, 10-year funding, in a sense, would be a floor, not a ceiling, because otherwise that's a real problem there. And you have to think about what the principles are. So I can imagine, and we're working on this now to work up principles, Alex can say more, but you could imagine that one set of criteria might be something like you've got a world-class, undoubtedly well-run organisation which is doing really important long-term fundamental research, and it's been going for some time and we know it goes in the right direction. Why would you ask them to keep coming back every 3 years to get renewed? You could give them a longer runway to do things. Another might be that you've got an industrial sector which requires long-term partnership to achieve what it needs to achieve, and it's very clear these are quite long-term solutions, and you could imagine certain things in the energy space that might fall into this, where 10-year funding would actually provide some certainty for the industrial partner that they've got something to work with. So we're working on these principles, and we will come out and describe what those principles are and which things fall into this category. It's absolutely not going to be, don't worry everybody, you've got 10 years and go away and get on with it.
So in practice, that means, does it not, that the notion of the 10-year will be rather selective?
Yes.
And aimed at certain kinds of activity and certain kinds of institutions, it seems to me, probably as well.
Yes.
All right. Well, that doesn't make things... When are we likely to know about this?
Do you want to come in on this?
So I think this is a phase 2 of the spending review kind of question. So phase 1 has been focusing this year and next year. So that's phase 2. So that's more like spring. And as the Minister says, we're just talking through what would the principles be, how would you select what kind of programmes, what kind of institutions. There's some great examples. The Crick Institute has some core funding over the long term, which... I'm sure many of you have spoken to Paul Nurse about the difference that's made in their ability to design fellowships differently, to design programmes differently. So there are examples out there. We've also done endowments recently, which is a different thing to 10-year budgets, but again, long-term certainty.
So core funding means that some things in Crick might be funded on a 10-year basis, where other things might have a quite different...
Those are existing examples. I think we're trying to explore what's most effective and what are we trying to do with the 10-year certainty. I think the other thing we're looking at is if you look at catapults, they're funded for 5 years. Right. So outside the existing settlements, they've got grant funding agreements. So that means they've got a plan for those 5 years, and we keep refreshing... not changing the objectives, but having some of the conversations so they're not applying again. But you've got the ability to say, to just talk through how they're achieving it. They're not given something so specific, they can't adapt to the changes in technology, but we've got a sense of what they might be trying to do, which for something like the Crick is doing amazing research. Thank you. And for something like a catapult might be a bit more specific. So we're working through all the options. It can't be the whole budget, because it's exactly as you say, there will be too many things you need to do shorter term and too much agility you need. So the principles by which you decide an institution or a programme is exactly what we're working through. So we can also be very clear about what would qualify for that, how would you get that, and how then the other approaches.
And it will be selective for an obvious reason, which is that one of the things we need to do with the funding budget is to create an opportunity to do new things.
Yes.
And to stimulate activities across disciplines and so on, which come up during the course of a 10-year cycle. So I would actually like to decrease the amount of committed funding that's given out. It's too high at the moment.
Well, that might be music to Treasury ears. Can I ask you, has the Treasury bought into this approach?
Well, we're going to look at it in SR25.
I see, so this joy is still ahead.
Can we move on to Lord Rees?
Yes.
Because I'm just conscious we have lots of people wanting to come in. So, Lord Rees.
Yes. Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to ask really about the organisation of research at the micro level, and in particular about UKRI. We know, of course, that there has been some criticisms of the operation of UKRI from the grant report, for instance, and those people who are dealing with individual grants find it cumbersome and slow, etc. And you'll be aware of this. And that leads to the more general question of the extent to which you as a minister should be at arm's length to UKRI, and to what extent it's your responsibility to intervene. And I think there were one or two instances where there were interventions in the appointment of heads of individual councils, for instance, under the last government. And the question is how much of that is appropriate, and how much of a general steer do you think that the government should give to UKRI?
Thank you. I've already said that I asked for the post to be re-advertised because I didn't think the job descriptions adequately reflected what we were trying to achieve as a government, and that it was important they did so. I think that's an appropriate level to intervene. I do not think it's appropriate for the minister to start saying who should get that job, although I will get a choice that comes up to me from the appointments panel with recommendations which I will look at. I've made an early decision that the chair of UKRI should get on and appoint the non-executive directors that they'd been through a process and wanted to appoint. I don't think that's something that ministers should be trying to micromanage as to who goes into that. And we quite quickly got the appointment of the new chair CEO of STFC appointed, again, because it had been through a process and it was all had been done properly. And I know, because in my 16 months or so when I was outside government as chair of the Natural History Museum, the frustration of getting these posts through quickly through a sclerotic system was rather annoying, and I was very keen not to be part of that problem inside government. So we're going to be much quicker on those types of things. So I think the role of the minister, and indeed the department, is to set the overall strategic direction, and also to hold the board of UKRI, for example, to account for running things well, and to have some clear metrics by which they can be evaluated. It's their job then to make sure that the organisation does what they say it's going to do.
Could I ask two specific things? Do you think it's really appropriate that Innovate UK should be under the same umbrella as the research councils, or does that make it too cumbersome?
Well, I think it's a fundamental question about UKRI. My own view is that, and I've said this publicly many times before, UKRI should not be a research council on top of the research councils.
Yes.
It should be a strategic organisation that is able to accommodate within it a diversity of research funding approaches. And I am concerned that a number of new and more innovative funding approaches got set up outside UKRI because it was deemed, probably correctly, that UKRI as it was set up didn't have the ability to actually manage that diversity appropriately. So I am clear in the job descriptions that we sent out, UKRI is not a monolithic corporate organisation. It's something that ought to be able to have underneath it a mix of things, and it ought to see the overall landscape and be able to understand where that can be greater than the sum of the parts and what it might do to facilitate that. So that's the model I think we need to work for, and in that model UKRI could fit perfectly happily, because it's not a research council, it's something quite different with a different set of objectives. Innovate UK, sorry.
So could ARIA fit into it?
Well, at the moment, I think ARIA has got off to a terrific start. I really do. And I was a board member, so I've got to be careful.
Can we learn something for how UKRI should work?
Well, I do think that going forward, if UKRI got into the position I've just described, then you could imagine all sorts of different things sitting underneath it and working perfectly well and being left alone to do their own things and not having to sort of be homogenised against everything else. That's the model that I think we need to aim for. I will say, at the moment, I don't think anyone should touch ARIA.
Baroness Willis would like to come in, I think, on a related point.
Yes, it is on a related point, but it's actually come through to Horizon Europe versus UKRI and our grant funding in this country. I'm very delighted to hear all this strategic direction and this 10-year funding bid and what's going to happen there. But my question really is, I am still very concerned about the pure research and where that sits within all of this. And what I have seen, I sit on a ERC panel, and I've sat on NERC panels. And the difference, I think, in the way the ERC looks at the more fundamental blue skies research versus where we are with the UK and the peer review system, they are miles apart. And I've just wondered how all of this then aligns within this new strategic direction that you are outlining.
Thank you. I agree the ERC forms a very important, different funding mechanism, and it's interesting it funds things that wouldn't necessarily have got funded in the UK system. That in itself is useful.
Yes.
So that idea of a different group of people, a non-domestic group of people looking at things and giving funding, I think is really, really important. It goes back, though, to my opening statement about understanding what the percentage of total spend on curiosity-driven research is that we want to have as a country that is a knowledge-based economy, and being explicit about it. And I think that's where we need to get to for SR25, to try and be much clearer about that, because then I think it gives the research councils the ability to understand where they can do things a bit differently and take risks on very early research, which might have most of it has no obvious application at all.
I mean, do you see a situation, or is there a possibility of a situation where actually that sort of blue skies research is funded via Horizon, and that actually the more applied end or the more sort of strategic direction of the 10-year sits within the UK central budgets?
I wouldn't favour that. I think we have to be doing that domestically as well. Yeah. I'm very pleased the ERC does it also, and I strongly support the idea that having both of those systems in play is important, because whatever you do, and I've chaired enough grant panels in the past to know whatever you do, ultimately the domestic look is a bit different from the international look, and so you're always going to get a slightly different answer from the ERC than the one you'd get from your domestic panel.
But there is a risk that that's the way it will be perceived, I think, that by the sort of and so this comes back to what percentage of the budget do you think is going to be really ring-fenced for blue skies?
I agree, and I think just finding out what we do now is the first challenge.
Yeah.
Are you worried that ARI budgets might get cut in the spending review?
Well, I think we're in the process of a spending review, and my intention is to make sure that we get the best outcome for science and technology we can.
Well, we'd be very, very keen to support you in that, I'm sure. Lord Borwick, did you want to come in quickly? Yes.
Yes. In your opening statement, you said a couple of times about these long-term budgets as the economy allows it to grow. Does that include, if the economy does not allow it to grow, reducing it, in your mind? I mean, how fixed are these budgets? Are we going to see, in government, you don't see long-term budgets other than for roads and other defence and other capital investments that take more than a few years. And they tend to have a habit of expanding rapidly, way above their original budget. And the economy not allowing them to grow as much as the people who are in that project would like it to grow. Do you see that as a danger of these long-term research budgets?
Well, I think the demands for a science technology budget are always going to be greater than the ability to deliver against it. That's normal everywhere.
Indeed.
I think I'm a realist. In other words, if the economy doesn't grow, it's very difficult to grow everything else. And so that's why actually a big focus of the more applied side of this has to be on economic growth and making sure we get it. And as I've said, my job is to make sure that the science and technology budget is properly protected and can grow.
Isn't that likely to end up with even less agreement between science and politicians as to what is practical? Because, as you say, it's going to be defined fundamentally by what's happening on the economy, and yet it's being advertised as a long-term fixed budget.
Oh, no. I just want to absolutely distinguish between the two different bits. My argument about the curiosity-driven research is that is something that you just need to accept that you're going to fund.
Yes.
And it's not 100% of the budget by any means, but it's something that we absolutely need to look after. Then there's the whole bit which is completely targeted towards the things that are government priorities, and that includes growth, of course, as the number one priority. And I think we need to show to politicians how you can use that much more to get growth. This isn't something off to one side. This is a fundamental prerequisite for growth. And, I've been in a global company and see what global companies do. And companies will often reach for cutting the R&D budget at times of stress.
Yeah.
Those that do tend to go in one direction and one direction only, not the good direction. And those that maintain it and actually invest in that at the same time as making cuts in other areas tend to do rather well. And AstraZeneca is a great example of that.
Lord Lucas, you were hoping to come in briefly, I think.
Minister, where in your structure, Minister, do we look for the drive and the accountability to make sure that research quality improves over time, technical quality, and that funding doesn't get stuck with consensus science, but the challenging ideas also receive a share?
I think that's a fundamental role for UKRI.
Then
Chairman,
Lord Rees was desperate to come back in, so please, yes.
Really follows from what Lord Lucas just said. Do you think the balance of pure research between universities and standalone institutes is right or needs to shift? I mean, university staff, as you know, feel under more pressure and harder for them to get involved in long-term research. And I wonder if you feel that one needs to have more standalone institutes. I guess the Faraday battery technology is an example. Does one want to have more in that direction, like the MRC institutes, because it's hard for universities, given the other pressures on university staff, to be internationally competitive in some of these frontier areas?
Well, as you know, Lord Rees, this is an area that comes up time and time again as to what the relative split between those things are. So I'll make a few comments. The first is, again, at the investment summit yesterday, I was struck by the number of big global investors who were raving about the UK university system and how much benefit they saw of the research that goes on there. So we've got a system which is quite different, as you know, from the system in France and other countries and Germany, and our system is very based on research going on in universities. I think that's an important part of what we need to do. Second point is there is a sort of logic to what happens in universities in terms of teaching. And I know this was true for me. I suspect it was true for you and many others. I had the good fortune as an undergraduate to be taught by people who were extremely research active. That, I think, is important. There's something about seeing these people, interacting with them and being inspired by them. And then the third point is, I think some of our institutes are absolutely outstanding, and we need to be very careful to make sure that they are properly looked after and get the chance to do what they do. I am absolutely not a fan of endless announcements of new institutes which apparently solve a problem but aren't properly funded and can't deliver it adequately. And so I think we've got to be very careful and make sure if we do institutes, we do them properly.
We move on to vaccines and Lord Drayson.
Last week we heard evidence from several of those who were instrumental in the development of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, of which of course you played a very important part. They told us how the UK at that time had the capability to move very quickly from the academic research which was being done into the virus through to scale up. And they told us that that capability has effectively been lost. A direct quote was, "If Marburg gets out of hand, we are not in a great position." So have you, in your first 100 days, been able to make an assessment of the current preparedness of the UK to have a sovereign national capability, a standby ability, if you like, to scale up and manufacture a new vaccine?
Yeah. I might respectfully to the witnesses slightly disagree with how well they think we were placed in 2020. We were on the verge of absolutely not being able to do that. And for decades, the vaccine infrastructure of this country had gradually eroded. We no longer had a major manufacturer of vaccines based in this country, even though we've got the company that's the number one vaccine manufacturer in the world, GSK, but all of its facilities were overseas, and we had lost capability in manufacturing and scale up of vaccines. It took quite an effort to get that back in place. It was fortunate that we had skills. Many of them actually were people who'd recently retired from the big companies but had those skills, and that we had some facilities that we were able to repurpose and get going. So I think we should not think that there was a very good situation at the beginning of 2020. There was not a good situation, but we were able to pull it together and rectify. Where we are now is there are now domestic manufacturers of vaccines. So AstraZeneca, of course, are now a vaccine company in the way that they weren't before. And we've got BioNTech and Moderna here. So we've got two new messenger RNA companies based here. And we need to keep looking at what the facilities are. And I had a conversation just recently regarding a vaccines facility, which is part of the cell and gene therapy catapult, which was acquired during the COVID time. So there are facilities, and I think it's important that we do look at those and ask, are they adequate? I just want to pick up on something in relation to the 100-day mission, which was the project I chaired for, co-chaired with Melinda Gates for the 2021 G7, which laid out a plan to be able to get to a vaccine, therapeutic and diagnostic within 100 days of a new pandemic or epidemic being identified. And one of the things that we were clear about in that report is it's not a good idea to have standby facilities. In other words, if your facility is not being used the whole time, it's very, very difficult to get it to work properly during that time. You need facilities that are being used, so we need to make sure we've got a vibrant vaccine sector in the UK. That's our biggest protection against being inadequate.
So, given that we lost our vaccine manufacturing capability through foreign takeover of UK production, how are you going to ensure that industry invests in an onshore UK manufacturing facility, given that we saw national interest of governments playing a big part during the COVID pandemic?
Well, I think there are, as I say, there's an increase already going on in terms of the domestic vaccine manufacturing with AZ, BioNTech, Moderna doing things here, and all I would say is I don't have the answer to what we do long term, except to try and encourage the most effective vaccine industry in the UK we can, and to make sure that some of that is linked to manufacturing. And I think that's a key industrial strategy point that I'm sure will be looked at in the life sciences sector of the industrial strategy.
They also highlighted two other points of concern. One was that the academic research around vaccines was dependent upon intermittent grant funding, which was very unsure, and which they were concerned that was not being maintained with any sort of strategic oversight. I'm interested in your comments on that. And secondly, a lack of clarity of where ministerial responsibility lay for preparedness of of ensuring that the UK has a sovereign capability in vaccine manufacturing. So using a defence analogy, if there is let's say, a foreign manufacturer that has a factory in the UK, the government can make sure that facility is used to make a vaccine to immunise the UK population.
Yeah. On the grant funding, I mean, that comes back to the question of, what constitutes a longer term funding and why would you do certain things in different ways. And I think that's definitely something that should be looked at in this context. On the point about where does responsibility lie, this was exactly the challenge that we found in 2020, which was this is sort of, if you like, it was benign neglect. There wasn't somebody who thought it was their job. And if you look at the very last words of the Module 1 report for the COVID inquiry, they actually quote something that I said at the inquiry, which is, you don't have an army because you expect to have a war every year. And you should think of this preparation in the same way. You need things that you're going to have, but they have to be used. And so that means industrial strategy needs to accept that part of what we do is to stimulate a good vaccines industry in this country because we're going to need resilience in vaccines. And so making sure that we have a plan for a successful industry, I think, is the best defence, rather than simply say, well, we're going to build a facility and it's going to be kept cold, but somehow it'll miraculously be brilliant when a pandemic hits.
That's very fair to have a strategy, but just to push my question, so who is the minister responsible for ensuring that strategy works?
It's the Cabinet Office Minister. For the overall pandemic preparedness, it sits in Cabinet Office with the CDL.
So with Pat McFadden?
Yes.
Can we move on to Lord
Strasbourg?
That's my understanding, yes. And in DHSE, there are various contributors.
No bits to it. So there's a group within Cabinet
sits
Office.
There, yes.
Lord Strasbourg.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Minister. The UK's strategic partnership with Moderna covers mRNA vaccines, but isn't there a risk that we're putting all our eggs in the mRNA basket when what is needed is a range of technologies?
Yes, there's a much bigger risk, which is an historic risk, and one that I alerted government to when I joined in 2018, of putting all our eggs in the eggs basket. Because the egg-based approach to vaccines, of course, is extremely risky, particularly if you get an outbreak of bird flu. So you're right, you need a range of technologies. We're actually very fortunate in this country. We have viral vector vaccines with the Oxford group, which is an outstanding group. We have messenger RNA vaccines, which you're right will be good for some things and no doubt not so good for others, and very good by the looks of it, at least for the moment. We'll see where it ends up in terms of cancer vaccines, which is very interesting. And we have traditional plants as well, and we've got a significant manufacturing capability around Liverpool as well in this area. So we do have different technologies, and you're right, you absolutely can't look at it and say messenger RNA is the answer to all vaccine problems, because I don't believe it is.
But are the Cabinet Office making sure that we maintain all of those different capabilities?
Well, I mean,
if they're responsible for this.
They're responsible for overall planning for risk, and of course DHSC has an accountability through UKHSA has an accountability for those parts of pandemic preparedness. So the biosecurity strategy lays out who has responsibility for each bit of this system.
Can we be confident that somebody is making sure that we have all of these different routes available to us?
Well, I think,
because I'm not quite clear from that, I'm afraid.
Well, I think the answer is the biosecurity strategy is looking at this, and that's in the Cabinet Office to make sure
that's where we will find this. Okay, thank you, Baroness Neuberger.
You've answered most of this. Thank you very much, Minister. But I just want to ask you about the possibility of a peacetime vaccine task force. You won't be surprised to hear me ask about that. Which is completely accepting that you don't want to go from a cold start from facilities that aren't being used. But if you did need to scale up quickly, do we need some kind of peacetime vaccine task force that takes that on board?
I think that UKHSA needs to understand how it would respond to any outbreak. And the reason that I set up the 100-day mission was to try and get a global consensus and activity around what needs to happen. And they published now, it's now got very strong sort of international drive to make this happen. I'm very keen the UK stays completely in the middle of this, and the risk is that it wouldn't have done, because I was actually chairing it, then I left, and so there's now UKHSA needs to make sure it's fully plugged in. But if you look at what they did for Mpox, they tested all the things that we tried to put in place and said, well, where are we on the 100 days for vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics? And they published a very good update at day 45 saying where we thought we'd got to, which systems were now working, which systems were not. It's exposed some weaknesses. So briefly, the situation was vaccines pretty good, not least because the vaccines technologies are now much more programmable and therefore easy to sort of switch into new things. Diagnostics, much better, particularly around availability of PCR diagnostics, not yet for lateral flows for that. Therapeutics, lagging. And that is the big area where I think we've got a gap, which is mainly a technological gap, which is because messenger RNA and viral vector vaccines allow you to sort of instantly get something, you haven't got that for therapeutics. I do think that is where AI, and AI is overused in all sorts of... This is true. This is the, building from what Demis Hassabis and John Jumper got the Nobel Prize for. That type of really serious AI applied to drug discovery is going to potentially be the thing that allows you to sort of do a much more rapid dial-up for this type of approach. But we're not there yet. I mean, it's still quite a long way to go to get that right.
Okay, but you don't particularly want a task force?
Well, I think that there was something really galvanising about the way we brought people together to have a clear aim. I think there's a danger that the task force that you set up in peacetime might just drift a bit. And so I think it does need focus. It needs somebody to say, I'm in charge of this. But I don't know whether a task force is the right answer. I don't know, Alex, whether you want to comment on this.
I think it would need to be really clear what it did. Otherwise, I think the risk in all bureaucracies is you create your own bureaucracy, perhaps not achieving the outcomes. I think you've got organisations like, you've got SAGE, for example, and Government Office for Science, and I think that is an ongoing capability, to the Minister's point, that gets used all the time. So that's being tested. So I think there are different ways that we prepare for particular events and do dry runs and scenario planning. I think some of those routes might well be, those are being looked at. I think they're quite helpful ways. I think the task force being really clear what it would do, what would the end point be, and what would good look like. Otherwise it can become a little bit part of the bureaucracy, and that is not
more of the bureaucracy. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I'm sure many people will be reassured by some of the things you've said about UKRI. We're going to move on to questions related to our inquiry on engineering biology, and Baroness Willis is going to kick those off.
Do you have a statement to make at the beginning of this, or not, on engineering biology?
Well, only that I suppose I published a report saying we need to take engineering biology very seriously. So
good, redundant. But obviously the new government. So you do plan to retain the strategy, do you, in the national vision for engineering biology? So
that strategy was put together following extensive consultation with industry and others, and it seems like a very sensible thing to keep.
So what are the priorities of this sector, or what do you see as the key priorities of the sector? We've heard the most extraordinary set of evidence actually on this, and as a biologist I found it, there have been so many aspects of engineering biology I'd never heard of before. So I'd be very interested just to hear where you see the priorities for the UK on this.
I'll bring Izzy in on this as well, but I think that this is now reaching a stage where this is very real and is beginning to turn into the true idea of being able to program biology to do all sorts of things, as you've heard. It's very advanced in some areas, like in medicine, where cell and gene therapies, and we've got good infrastructure for that, and their needs are going to be quite different from some of the other things I've seen over the past couple of months, like using cells to capture carbon dioxide and then create a slurry which you can take off and make into concrete. Things like that are early but quite exciting. And biofuels from living organisms, and then at the most extreme end of early, in a sense, is the work of Jason Chin's laboratory in the Laboratory for Molecular Biology, creating totally artificial organisms able to really do extraordinary things potentially. So we've got a range of activities. Each one requires something a bit different, and we need to fund the appropriate science, both through things like the Laboratory for Molecular Biology, but through the various centres that have been created with the £100 million that went into the engineering biology areas. We need to create the skills, and I was very impressed when I visited Science Creates in Bristol, which has had money from Innovate to do this, and it's trying to take people from the university and help them understand what it would take to take their ideas into something, to train them. And Imperial have a similar, and other universities do as well. So I think we're doing okay on that. We've got to make sure that the link between the biology and the AI is right, because that's going to be an important tool in all of this. So we're going to have to train people in that interdisciplinary area. And then there's the infrastructure question that comes up. The biofoundries, of which 5 have been funded, have been really good. I think 49 companies have benefited from interaction with the biofoundries, and there is some ability for scale-up processing, so that's pretty good on the cell and gene therapy side. The Centre for Process Innovation, I think, is really important in this system, and we almost certainly are going to need to do more. And the reason I'm being a little bit hesitant about what the more looks like is we know from some of the examples in other countries that creating a big infrastructure of stainless steel fermenters and so on that sit there and don't do anything, again, is not a helpful way to do this. We just need to really think how to leverage the private sector investment in the right places and what government money can do to make that happen, rather than assuming that we know exactly what infrastructure we need as this really exciting emerging area comes up. I don't know, Izzy, whether you want to add to that.
Not too much. I mean, us in DSIT really focusing on that foundational ecosystem, so pulling through that really exciting novel R&D, but also creating a landscape of the right skills, the right infrastructure, and the right interventions around things like tech finance, and then working with the rest of government to make sure that we're pulling through those exciting applications through to anywhere in the economy it might touch. And it's quite heartening to read that list of 8 sectors in the industrial strategy, and the majority of them, perhaps not financial services, but the majority of them have really exciting applications ranging from manufacturing to clean energy to defence, and even through to the creative industries where we're seeing fashion handbags and dyes for clothes. So I think for us it's trying to find that balance of creating that ecosystem where all the companies can thrive, and then working with partners across government to pull it through.
Let's just follow up on one question on that. So you mentioned DSIT again, but I think a lot of the engineering biology also sits within DEFRA. And I wondered how you managed to bring those sorts of technologies and those approaches into the thinking of these other departments.
Yes, so we at the working level work really closely with all the departments in government that we think have expertise in this, DEFRA being a really, really critical example, as well as the MOD, Department for Energy, Department for Business and Trade, and we convene them really, really regularly. So the engineering biology vision was not written just by DSIT, it was a truly cross-government document. We worked with all of those partners right from the initiation to make sure we had the right focuses, the right areas, and you can hopefully see throughout the document a few different examples of the funding areas like the future food and the future fuels that have been pulled through.
I can't stand.
Well, I've got a rather difficult question to ask you, really, and that is when you consider other countries like the United States, where the United States executive order has already allocated $2 billion to engineering biology and a share of the $200 billion CHIPS and Science Act funding over the next 10 years for engineering biology, against that vast amount of investment, do you ever find yourself wondering what it is that we can do in this country with such a smaller scale?
Well, I think it's maybe 2 different bits to this. If you look at the fundamental science in engineering biology, I think we're doing incredibly well. And I've given the example of Jason Chin's laboratory, which is truly, truly world leading on this and is making a huge difference. Where we know that there are issues, not just in this area, but in many other tech areas, is around scale up. And that is a perennial problem and a really important one, and needs the full attention of the science and technology framework. So it's not just funding, although it is funding, and it needs private sector funding. That's why the Mansion House reforms for pensions are an important step in the right direction. And as you probably know, 3 of the major companies have now gone down the route of the Mansion House Compact. So I think it's Schroders, Phoenix and L&G. That's a great start. That will unlock significant capital. It needs regulatory approaches, which is why the Regulatory Innovation Office has this as one of the areas it's going to look at, and why money went to the FSA, 1.5 or 1.6 million to the FSA to do a sandbox on regulatory approaches to engineering biology for foods. And it's why skills are such an important area, with doctoral training centres, the sorts of things I've mentioned at Science Creates and others, and why BBSRC has funded standards and metrology to try and get those skills levels right. So I think this is exactly where the science and technology framework comes to play, and we need to unlock private sector investment to go alongside this. This can't all be government funding.
But in your view, is there at least an appreciation that this is a really exciting area for the future? And if we're going to make it work, this is the type of issue, the scale-up issue, that is going to be crucial to making it the difference between a UK success in the future or another example of an area that we quote in 10 years' time where we somehow look back and say, why did we miss the boat?
Well, I think, as you'll know, that's been true in a lot of areas over the past 50 years, probably, and we can't afford to do that again. And it's why, in the letter that I wrote on behalf of the Council for Science and Technology to the Prime Minister in my previous role, we said there's a window of opportunity to get this right. And that's a relatively short window. It is really important that the capital side of this is recognised. As you will know, we lose a lot of companies at the sort of £200 million plus investment round that go overseas, and that's why I think that the pension reforms is a really, really critical part of this.
Annis Noble-Jones, you wanted to...
I just wanted to partly make a comment on the evidence you've just given us. I have very strong recollection from the evidence that we had from people doing engineering biology, that they had 2 issues. One was not being able to afford the infrastructure, not being able to afford actually the cost of going to the laboratory. Very specific about that. And secondly, they also said that the regulatory scene was very disorganized, disparate, didn't really have much shape, which was also beginning to become a problem, in that you couldn't then, in the absence of it was difficult to sort of create the notion of the industry and the various parts that linked to each other. And I just wonder what you feel about that, because that seems to me to be actually short of the scale-up problem, which you're quite right, is one of our classic shortcomings. It doesn't really get them to the point of being firmly established as really sound startups. So what do you feel about that?
Well, exactly. It comes back to sort of all the angles of the science and technology framework. Regulatory side, this is why it's one of the 4 areas that the Regulatory Innovation Office is picking up. And the Regulatory Innovation Office is precisely designed to do that. Look at it and say, what are the things that are stopping this emerging area from progressing? Which regulators do we need to bring on board, upskill, link with others, enable with sandboxes, try to make sure they've got the appropriate ability to attract the right skills into them to get this with a really sharp focus. And again, the reason that I was keen when we start the Regulatory Innovation Office to focus on 4 areas is to do 4 areas fast, not 100 areas slowly. And to try and to say, if we can get some of these cracked, then that example will pull other people to want it in their areas. On the cost of infrastructure and the access to infrastructure, it goes back to my earlier answer. I think in some areas like cell and gene therapy, we're quite good now. It's some of the non-biomedical areas where the infrastructure access isn't where it needs to be for some of these companies scaling. But the answer is also not entirely easy, because just creating big infrastructure and hoping that someone's going to use it almost certainly isn't going to work. And it is something we're looking at, and it's something that we will consider as we think about future funding opportunities depending on the SR. Izzy, do you want to come in on that?
I think we're coming back to infrastructure in a subsequent question, so could we perhaps save that and we'll hear from you then, Izzy? Otherwise, when Lord Berkeley gets to his question, he'll have nothing to ask you. I just want to make sure that an answer to a previous question is clear, which I think it probably wasn't, which is on the point about vaccines, I just want to give the Cabinet Office is in charge of the biosecurity strategy overall. Vaccines, industry, do we have the right vaccine industry, is an OLS question, Office for Life Sciences. And then UKHSA, of course, has the more practical, immediate, what are we going to do for a pandemic? And the OLS is yours?
OLS is mine and Minister Merrin's.
Which gives some reassurance, I think, to us.
And I am quite focused on getting this industry side right.
Thank you. We move on to Baroness Neuberger.
So the national vision identifies talents and skills as crucial for the engineering biology sector. We've talked a lot, actually, in this committee about skills. And we'd really like to ask you what assessment the government's made of the skills that are most needed, and what domestic training offers will be put in place to fill some of these gaps. So it's a general, what are we going to do here?
Well, it's fun. Implicit in the question is right. This is an interdisciplinary problem. And as I've already said, I think there's a mixture of biological skills, process engineering skills, AI skills. There's a very wide range. What are we doing? Well, there's a lot of people funded by BBSRC generally, and then there are some specific ones for Eng Bio. Centre for Doctoral Training in Bristol and Oxford put together. Advanced therapies apprenticeships are in place, and indeed a skills training network for that. So that's more on the medical, biomedical side. I was very impressed, as I say, in some schemes that Innovate put in place, iCure, and I met some of the people in Bristol last week, in Bristol Tech Week, in Science Creates, where they're trying to sort of bring people and enable them with the skills needed, not only to do the science, but also to do the entrepreneurial bit as well. And I think we've got training in some specific areas that I've mentioned, like metrology and standards, which it's really quite a difficult area for this, because I know from the time when I was doing cell and gene therapies, defining what the product is unbelievably difficult, because it's not like a chemical or something where you can absolutely define the product quality. So I think we've got a lot of training to do across a very wide front, and I'd say we've started, but I don't think we are there in terms of what's required at the moment yet. Izzy, do you want to?
Nothing I'd particularly add. I think it just comes down to that really difficult challenge of you sort of need every skill, so you just need to work on that really foundational STEM pipeline and see talent and skills coming through across the sciences, and then encouraging people into this really exciting technology.
We keep asking you this, but who's in charge?
Of the Eng Bio?
Well, of trying to pull this.
I think that's us.
That's it. I was assuming it was, but yeah, I'm hoping it was. So it's over to you.
Even though, as pointed out, there are obviously work going on in DEFRA and in DFT, but
yeah.
We have to get we have to get that right.
Thank you. Could I ask you, Minister, about one problem we encounter in a lot of settings, which is the issue of visas. I don't think I can rehearse the arguments to you. I'm sure we're pretty familiar with. But we are dismayed by the immigration health charge, all the upfront costs, that somebody wants to come here to work faces, and the small number of visas that are actually available, and the fact that the salaries they get here, are
quite modest compared with some of the places they could otherwise go. Now you said you'd hardly been to any company or activity where there weren't a large number of non-Brits, which is a very cheering thought. Nevertheless, these willingness to come and work in this country is not absolutely guaranteed against the background of these very high initial costs, which I think are deterrents. So the question is, what do you rate as being the prospects of being able to change this policy? And can you have a dialogue with the Home Office about this, with an aim to actually, what seems to me, realise a national ambition, which is to increase the number of talented people who come here rather than putting them off?
On the cost side, I think it is important that the costs of that can now be met on Horizon grants and on UKRI grants. So there is a way to get those funded. If somebody's working more than 50% on the grant, they can have the costs covered.
Does that include the health surcharge costs
as well? Yes, it does.
Thank you.
Yes. And many, but not all, of the charities have also agreed to that. So it's not everybody. So it's not a panacea, but there is a way forward there. The global talent visa numbers, I think, increased from about 7,000 in 23 to 8,000 in 24. So that's a 16% increase in those numbers. So it is moving in the right direction. And as you might imagine, I've been very clear that I think that this is an important thing to get right, and have had discussions with Home Office and others, and the Migration Advisory Committee is looking at the skills needs in different sectors and will continue to provide advice to the Home Office.
Thank you. Well, we wish you the best of luck.
Yes, good luck in your discussions with the Home Office. Baroness Young.
Perhaps when you're talking to the Home Office, you might like to also raise the issue of families not being able to be brought over.
Yeah.
As I noticed from the Migration Advisory Committee's latest data, is that there's been a huge reduction which they're laying down to the fact that families can no longer come. I wonder if you've had a look at those figures.
I'm aware of those figures, and I know it's something that the Migration Advisory Committee will continue to advise on, and the Home Office will keep under review.
Can I just ask quickly, can we expect some more doctoral training centres in engineering biology? Because I think UKRI itself told us in its evidence that the fact there are only 2 in engineering biology was a positive first step, but insufficient to meet demand. So I think UKRI recognises the need for more. Is that something we can hope to see?
We're obviously in the middle of a budget review at the moment, and we've got one now and one in spring next year, and we will be arguing for the best we can get for the science budget, and this is an area which is important to continue to develop, and UKRI will use its budget to try and support the areas that are priorities, and this is a priority.
Lord Drayson.
In your remarks, you've already highlighted your concerns about the UK's ability to scale up the strength that we have in the early stage sciences. And this is something which the previous government also identified, and you've mentioned House reforms. Really interested in what the new Labour government is doing on top of these already announced measures to address this very serious problem. The rate at which we're losing capital from the UK, is continuing. The decline in the UK London stock market. So what is the Labour government doing differently to address this urgent problem that the UK has, which is going to be central to solving the productivity and wealth creation problem we have?
Well, there was a very large investment summit yesterday in London on exactly this topic, and I have to say the atmosphere at that was one that was really rather pro-investing in the UK, which I was pleased to see, with several comments about the need to attack the areas that I've talked about, regulation, as a way to make it easier for people to see the pathway, and that's why, again, the Regulatory Innovation Office is so important. The procurement situation, which is why I think the Procurement Act is going to make a difference. The industrial strategy, so that you've got a clear line of sight in sectors, as well as some of the underpinning abilities to go across with the technologies that are needed across. All of those things are going to matter, and I think that's going to create an environment where investment's going to be more likely. And of course, the National Wealth Fund exists to try and help with some of that co-investment as well, and the BBB Growth Fund that was announced yesterday. So I think there are lots of steps in place. Now, I'm not going to tell you that's a panacea, and we know that there's more that needs to be done on the pension front. I mean, Mansion House, great, probably on its own not enough. And we know that there's going to be a question about how employers take up that offer of DC pensions in that fund, because we need to get lots of people into it. My own view is, if I was fortunate enough to be in my 20s or 30s now, I'd want my pension fund to be in this high risk area and high return area. So we've got to get that bit of it right as well. So this is the whole reason why this is a cross-government activity. It's not a single intervention that's going to make a difference.
That issue of pensions being invested in high-tech, high-risk activities is one which is currently still a major debate within the investment community within the city, and not one where pension funds universally support the idea. But really quite interested, to your 20 to 30-year-old self, to those 20, 30-something technology entrepreneurs today who are considering whether they list their company in the UK or list their company in the United States, what would you say to them as to why they should consider listing their company in the UK?
I'm just going to make one point before I answer that, which is the other thing that I'm very keen that Innovate and others do, and UKRI does, is look at the join-up, because there are too many examples of companies which have had a good start with an Innovate grant, have got a little bit of venture funds from somewhere, get some sort of product or close to some sort of product of some sort, and then there's absolutely no procurement pool. So we need to get both ends of this system right. And I think what I would say to the entrepreneurs, and have said, because I've been around meeting a lot of them, is these actions that the government are taking on more than just saying we'll put a bit more grant funding in, because that's not the issue, is regulation, procurement, unlocking scale capital, co-investment from government where it's appropriate to do so. We have got examples where that has been shown to work. So the National Security Strategic Investment Fund has done that and shown that government can play a role in making this happen. So I think there are some schemes in place now which should create greater optimism for being able to keep companies in the UK. Fundamentally, as you'll know better than anyone, this requires private capital.
So you've highlighted the role of procurement, and governments for years have highlighted the importance of procurement in enabling scale-ups. Often, as you've highlighted in the new industrial strategy, a number of the markets are effectively controlled by the government, defence, health. So we've heard evidence to the committee that the risk-averse sort of culture within government, the unwillingness, unlike in the United States, to place an order for a capability prior to that capability actually having been proven, is what's holding back the ability of companies to go from that early startup phase to scale up. So what is it that the Labour government will do differently to address that risk aversion in the procurement process?
The Procurement Act will make that more possible to take that risk. I think clear indication of risk appetite for this from ministers is important, and let me just explain what I mean by that. If you look at what happened during the time of the Vaccines Task Force, there was not a need for a single change in regulatory rules or a single change in procurement rules in order to create a system where both regulation was pro-innovation and procurement was pro-innovation, but it required clear and unambiguous ministerial oversight. And I've said this publicly, so I'll say it again. It's very likely, in my view, that if the Vaccines Task Force had failed, which was the most likely outcome at the beginning, that it would have been slated as a waste of public money and a terrible thing for somebody to have done. That is the thing that drives conservative behaviours of not taking risks on the approach we take to investment and procurement. So we have to get that risk appetite right as part of this, and that's precisely what's behind some of the new things that have already been announced and the intention of the industrial strategy.
So we had evidence actually from Dr. Clive Dix, who, as you know, took over the Vaccine Task Force from Kate Bingham, that a clear sense of concern that the attitude to risk, aversion to risk, which is within the civil service, had led to a sort of return to risk averseness after the sort of the disbandment of the Vaccine Task Force, and gave a sense of the really deep-seated sort of cultural aversion that exists within any administration, not to criticise civil servants, but to say the rewards don't come from taking risks in the civil service. So how is the Labour government going to address that in the civil service?
It is a matter of ministerial clarity on the risk profile that is acceptable, and the civil service believing that, and the National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee understanding that innovation inevitably comes with risk. And I've been and spoken to the board of the National Audit Office on this very topic because I've been so concerned about it, and they have assured me that, this is before I became a minister, that they would audit against the risk profile that was stated at the outset. So in other words, if you said this is a portfolio risk and we understand that 9 out of 10 things are likely to fail, that's the risk profile they'll audit against. Now that hasn't been put to the test, and it's very important it is, because the first time that a risk is taken and an investment goes pear-shaped, which it will, yep, and somebody then gets hauled in front of various committees to explain why this ridiculously stupid thing had been done and it was so obvious to everybody it would fail, the risk appetite will be right down to the bottom again. So this is something for all of us to be aware of, and it is a massive behavioural change, yes, which is not easy at all to get right.
All power to your elbow in achieving it. But interesting to hear from your colleagues as to whether they feel 100 days in that there's any sense of a change.
So I think, we've been looking quite a lot at this in DCIT, as you would imagine, given innovation is in our job title. I think there's a couple of examples where there are changes happening. Some of them started some months ago, but the Willits review, which was looking at business cases for R&D, where the current system incentivises you to be very risk averse in how you put together a business case, an economic case, how you approach it. It means you take a very long time to procure some technologies that have by that point moved on. And we're at the moment piloting a new approach to business cases that we are talking to Treasury and other colleagues about. There's real interest in from across government. That is one of the ways in which, if you can actually define some guidance that says what does good look like, and good does look like going a bit faster, taking a bit more risk, doing a different approach, that is a way in which you bake into the incentives for civil servants and others. This is how you do it, this is what good looks like. So there's, I think, some progress there. I think we're certainly having some conversations about both risk appetite within DCIT, but more broadly, but also how do we learn lessons from where we've set something up to try and take risk, and it has been hard for people to do so. So I'd give an example there of innovation accelerators. We were taking a portfolio approach to investing in programmes. That's not procurement, but it's a stage before, where there are some lessons to be learned about how do senior leaders ensure that more junior people taking those decisions were absolutely backed to take those risks. I think the final thing I'd flag is the NEO, I think, have heard some of the messages and are very keen to explore what are the incentives that are created sometimes by a concern about what the NEO might say, rather than the NAO would say necessarily what it does say. So there's a lot of behaviour just in case this happens in the bureaucracy review and elsewhere. So I think specific on business cases, learning some of the lessons, talking about risk appetite, and then some of those conversations with the NAO, none of that is going to solve the issue. But I think it does start to get to the incentives and the behaviours, and then what gets rewarded and celebrated is, I think, the final area I'd flag. Because if you don't see somebody taking a risk, it perhaps failing, and then people saying that was a really good thing to do, what did you learn? It is very hard to do this.
And NAO has been really responsive on this.
Can we move on to Lord Way then at this point?
Yes, welcome, Minister, to your role. I don't want to declare an interest as well because I'm an advisor to a number of venture capital funds and have written reports on how we can increase pension fund institutional money into startups. I know a lot of what I was wanting to ask has already been covered already, so I want to zero in on this kind of scale-up challenge and note some of the feedback coming, from the pensions industry and so on is. And as this whole post-Mansion House world evolves, around how do you right-size both the risk appetite of trustees of pension funds and so on, and the amount of capital they have to help sort of scale up British companies. For example, there's a real trend, as you probably know, in the pension industry to outsourcing to the likes of Schroders or others, a lot of pension sort of activity, and so alternative investments. They increasingly are managed by larger and larger sort of managers to the point where maybe the amount of money they have is too big for even scale-ups. It might be easy to do private equity or other sort of bigger infrastructure projects. What do you see the government doing to kind of address some of these issues, and also issues such as liquidity? That pensions often need to know the value of what's in their portfolios, and there are challenges. And just to follow up, this new National Wealth Fund and Innovate UK, are there roles that they can play in addressing some of these barriers? How is the new government thinking about the role that they're going to play?
You're stretching my limit of expertise quite hard there. I am not an expert on the details of pension funds. I am aware that there were many discussions, because I was involved in some of them, on whether the right model was to get big fund holders to actually create a new joint fund which would be able to take the risk with a few percent from everybody all in one pool. That isn't the route that's been gone down. It's 5% of individual funds. I'm very well aware that the issue of the scale of funds is important, because you expose a small fund to this degree of risk if it's going to cause problems with liquidity. And so there is something about consolidation of pension funds which became important in the Canadian system to solve that. But I think I'm in danger of becoming a super non-expert describing things that other people know better than I do.
But what do you see the government's role generally in trying to help grow this market, and especially the National Wealth Fund? Is there a strategic role it can play in market?
I think that So both the BBB Growth Fund and the National Wealth Fund are obviously designed to try and help get some of this capital unlocked, and they will work with their expert colleagues to work out the right way to do that.
Baroness Young, did you want to come in very quickly before we move to Lord Berkeley? No, Lord Berkeley.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, very interesting comments you've been making. I want to just go back to infrastructure, if I may. But before I do that, the role of the NAO in procurement is absolutely fundamental, and I hope you will add the voice to other people who said they need to be properly staffed and resourced to do it, because they've made a few cut price, shall we say, changes over the years, and it needs to be properly done from the bottom up. When it comes to infrastructure and for the engineering biology, I think what you've told us a great deal about it, but we did get some evidence about the lack of the pilot scale facilities, which some people found, but also equally important, a lack of knowledge about what research facilities and what development facilities were available. And we've got this new announcement, many announcements made yesterday, which is really good, I'm sure, but I hope the communications of this to the people that might want to use it will be beefed up, because we've had a lot of comments from people saying it's very difficult to know what's going on.
I don't know, Izzy, whether you want to talk about that. I mean, we're trying to make the all of the things on engineering biology as open and clear as we can. There's a group that comes together that looks at this, has got the experts on it, and we will continue to try and get that information out there. As I said, this is a very, very, in my opinion, a very, very key area for the UK.
Good, thanks. Yeah, thanks.
Could I just come unless Lord Berkeley is going to talk about infrastructure, are you going to talk about infrastructure?
Go on.
I thought I heard you say that you didn't think investment by government in significant infrastructure was the answer, and that it very much needed to be partnership with the private sector. But that is something that we've had from many of our witnesses who've been saying that it's that next stage when they actually need to do something for real but at a pilot level, long before they get into a real big partnership with another organisation. And that's the sticking point for them.
So I agree with that. I just want to be clear. So that's what we've done in cell and gene therapy. That's exactly what happened. There was that place. The CPI also offers that. My point is not that we don't perhaps need to do more of that, but we need to be really careful not to end up, and this is the experience from other countries, and we've spoken to them about it, creating a great big infrastructure which then just sits there, not being used properly. So we've got to get this to the right level, and I recognise that gap. And I think private sector increasingly recognise it. It's quite interesting, actually, the number of private sector investors who are thinking about investing in that sort of infrastructure.
Can I just go back on that, please, Chair? I mean, Baroness Young is absolutely right. One of the things, Minister, you said earlier was that you didn't want to see a lot of facilities with lots of polished stainless steel things sitting doing nothing. So if you want to take this forward, how are you going to do it? I mean, it's partly private sector, but the public sector has a role, partly in finance and partly in, as I said earlier, identification, what might be available.
Yep. About universities?
Sorry?
Universities seems to be, a lot of them have rather elderly infrastructure. Can we not do something combined which benefits them?
We're
as well
absolutely looking at this in the engineering plan. I mean, I'm not going to commit today to exactly what facilities will be in place, but I recognise this, and we know it needs to be part of how we think about our overall spending review outcome, and we know that it's something that is important for the community.
I stopped Dr. Webb from talking about infrastructure earlier, and I feel we should give her the chance to say what she was going to say at that point. So please have the floor.
I'll probably repeat a bit of what's already been heard. For us, we know how complicated this is. It's not simply the case of build a fermenter and that's what people need. They need different fermenters and different other sort of bioprocessing facilities of different sizes. In fact, the downstream processing, once you've grown up your, whether it's bacteria, fungi, other organism, is as critical and so variable depending on if you're going from medical grade, food grade, chemical grade. So the facilities here are not simple, and so for us we've spent a huge amount of time since the vision was published really assessing the evidence, working in particular with the Government Office for Science to help bolster that evidence building and make sure we're accessing all of the expertise. And we're now in that really focused window of having assessed what is out there, what might be needed, looked at those international models. I know you spoke to Biobase Europe in one of your earlier hearings, and you heard about what the US is doing around Biomade. So we've been doing a huge amount of evidence gathering so we can really think through what is right for the UK. And then, as the Minister said, we'll need to get through the future spending rounds before we're able to talk about any kind of public investment we might be doing around that.
But if I may just come back, you know it all and you've told us, and you're obviously very good at it, but you're going to tell everybody else.
We will do when we're able to talk about what we can do.
Thank you. So let's come to our final question from Viscount Stansgate.
Richard, I was told it's a 12 o'clock finish here, and I'm slightly tight for time, so I hope we can wrap up quite quickly.
We'll keep it short then.
Well then, I'll compress 12 lines. Are you developing, in effect, a sense of where, in the engineering biology landscape, the right ecosystems exist to scale up?
Sorry, am I...
Are you aware of the areas in engineering biology where the capacity to scale up and the right ecosystems exist for that to happen, and where there are other areas where you need to take further action to help create these ecosystems that will...
Subject areas, you mean,
yes,
or geographical?
I mean, for example, in areas involving artificial fuel, you know, maybe with chemical companies and fuel companies, we've already got the elements that required, but in other areas maybe not. And are you beginning to distinguish which areas are going to need further help?
And I've tried to allude to that. So I think on the cell and gene therapy thing, things are in quite a good shape, and there's some bits that need doing, but lots of the right bits are in place. If I look at foods, I think the regulatory bit's been a big block there, and that's why the Food Standards Agency has got this sandbox to try and help free that up. I think on carbon capture mechanisms and fuels, there's some quite good things. There's definitely a scale-up issue there that needs to be looked at. So I think there are specific things in different areas that we've got the landscape of and trying to help out as we can.
Okay.
I think we sort of felt that there needs to be a pull for some of this, and we can see the pull in the life sciences area. I think we were slightly concerned with some of the evidence session where we had one of the big chemical manufacturers, that we didn't feel in the chemicals and the fuels area that we were seeing the kind of pull that would mean you could do that work in the UK and actually get the benefit to the UK economy, rather than those early stage looking at how we might make synthetic fuels. We were worried that technology might go overseas if we didn't actually have the whole of the ecosystem pulling on it from both ends in a way in the UK.
I agree.
I think we may have one very quick follow-up from Baroness Young, and then we will let you go.
Rather than ask a question. And that is, it's really important in looking at this to think about the impact on land use in this country from feedstock requirements. And it will be no good in terms of fuel security if what we develop is a technology that we need to import the raw materials to create. End of statement.
Yep. Well, if only these things were easy.
At that point, I must say thank you very much and apologise about misunderstanding about the time of the ending of this session. So I hope we haven't held you up for your next meeting. But at that point, the meeting is formally closed.
Thank you very much.